They came in the dead of a Tuesday morning, armed not with hammers or lawsuits, but with rules, letters, and the kind of arrogance only an HOA could perfect. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and froze. My driveway, the one I'd poured sweat and weekends into, was suddenly theirs, claimed. Officially, signed, sealed, and threatened with fines that could eat through my savings faster than I could blink. At first, I thought it was a mistake, surely some clerical error. But no, this was deliberate. The same neighbors who smiled politely at barbecues now whispered behind my back. The same board members who nodded during meetings now sent letters filled with threats, citing bylaws I hadn't even known existed. Every rule felt like a trap, every regulation a weapon. And every day, the tension in my own driveway grew unbearable, like walking through a minefield where one wrong step could cost everything. I tried reasoning. I tried compromise. Nothing worked. Every appeal was met with cold bureaucracy, petty enforcement, and an almost theatrical enjoyment of my frustration. So, I had a choice: accept it, or fight back in a way they'd never forget. What would you do if the ground beneath your own home suddenly wasn't yours anymore? And how far would you go when the people sworn to protect your neighborhood become the very ones trying to take it from you? Life in our neighborhood had always felt like something out of a postcard. Tree-lined streets, sidewalks that echoed with the laughter of kids on bikes, and neighbors who waved as you passed by. My little house sat comfortably in the middle of it all. A modest, sun-washed home with a driveway that had seen countless family projects, late-night talks, and weekend cleanups. Every corner held a memory. The spot where I had planted tulips with my kids, the tire tracks from my old pickup truck after a weekend of yard work, the tiny patch where my dog loved to sunbathe. It was ordinary, peaceful, the kind of place where life felt steady and predictable. I had moved here hoping for calm, a community where neighbors looked out for each other, where homeownership felt like pride, not a battlefield. I worked hard to maintain the place, mowing the lawn meticulously, keeping the mailbox straight, even painting the trim every spring. It wasn't about perfection, it was about love, about care, about belonging. And for a while, it seemed like I had it all. Sunday barbecues with friends, late-night chats with neighbors over fences, kids running through yards freely, laughter spilling into quiet evenings. We were part of something larger than ourselves, a little microcosm where everyone's role was clear and life felt predictable. But of course, predictability is fragile. There were whispers in the neighborhood, small, almost imperceptible, about bylaws, rules, and oversight. The HOA, once a distant and abstract entity, had always been present in the background: letters about paint colors, reminders about mailbox upkeep, gentle nudges to keep the community standards high. At first, I barely noticed. After all, I had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. Still, I began seeing subtle signs. Neighbors who suddenly acted differently, meetings that carried a strange tension, the polite smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. A subtle rigidity was creeping into the community, the kind that suggested that the rules weren't just guidelines, they were tools. Tools for control, for asserting authority, for reshaping life according to someone else's narrow vision. And then came the day the letters arrived. Official, formal, impossibly precise. My driveway, my own patch of earth and concrete, was now, according to them, in question. It was a small note at first, almost bureaucratic, a statement about community boundaries and shared property concerns. But that little note planted a seed of unease, a seed that would grow into something that would consume months of my life, spark conflicts I could never have imagined, and force me to ask how far would I go to defend what was mine. I didn't know it then, but that day would mark the beginning of a battle that would turn my quiet, peaceful neighborhood into a minefield of petty disputes, bureaucratic absurdity, and escalating tension. What seemed like a minor brush with rules and regulations would become a confrontation that tested patience, sanity, and pride. After that first unsettling letter, life began to change in ways I couldn't have anticipated. At first, it was subtle, a lingering sense of being watched, neighbors glancing over fences, and a quiet but persistent pressure to comply with rules I didn't even know existed. Then came the official notices, each one more precise, more intimidating, and somehow more personal than the last. The HOA seemed to delight in creating a world where every small action, parking a car, trimming a bush, even leaving a hose out in the yard, could be twisted into a violation. I remember the first real fine, $50 for leaving a single garden tool on the driveway overnight. I had stacked it neatly beside the garage, thinking nothing of it. But apparently, The sight of a rake was enough to constitute a violation of community aesthetics. The notice was cold, bureaucratic, and infuriatingly vague. There was no human contact, no opportunity to explain. Just a rigid statement, signed by a board member who had probably never even walked past my house. That small fine was a warning, and it felt personal. And then came the inspection visits. 2 board members showed up unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. They measured, photographed, and scrutinized every inch of my property. The driveway, my beloved driveway, was under their microscope. They muttered about encroachments, about potential safety hazards, and about rules that no one in the neighborhood seemed to know in advance. I tried to stay calm, explaining my perspective, but they barely listened. Their faces were expressionless masks of authority. The tension escalated further when neighbors began taking sides, subtly at first, then openly. Some whispered that I was being difficult, that I didn't understand the responsibilities of community living. Others, perhaps quietly rooting for me, seemed anxious to see what would happen next. Every interaction in the neighborhood became a delicate dance of caution. I had to weigh every word, every movement. Even stepping outside to get the mail felt like navigating a minefield. Soon, the fines multiplied. Parking too close to the curb, not maintaining the acceptable flower beds, hanging a flag without approval. Each notice was more absurd than the last, each one a dagger aimed at my patience. I began documenting everything, the dates, the letters, the inspections, but it felt like preparing for a battle that was already underway. Every morning, I braced for the next letter, the next knock on the door. By midweek, the stress started seeping into daily life. Friends noticed the change. I was tense on edge, constantly calculating the risk of each action. I even considered selling the house, moving somewhere without this invisible tyranny looming over me. But the thought of giving up felt like surrendering to absurdity itself. I had worked too hard, invested too much, and loved this home too deeply. And then came the ultimatum. A single, menacing letter stamped with the HOA seal. The driveway had to be brought into compliance, or face escalating fines, legal action, and the possibility of liens. They claimed ownership over the edges of the driveway, arguing that the concrete extended beyond the property boundary into communal land. I had measured, I had photographs, I had legal documents, but none of that seemed to matter. Their authority, however petty or absurd, carried the weight of bureaucracy. Every day became a new confrontation. I tried mediation, sent polite emails, even requested a board meeting, hoping reason might prevail. But each attempt was met with cold bureaucracy, ignored messages, delayed responses, or worse, thinly veiled threats. They seemed to thrive on tension, on the psychological toll of making a homeowner feel small, powerless, and endlessly accountable. And it wasn't just me. I began hearing stories from other neighbors, people who had dared to trim their trees without approval, park outside the designated lines, or repaint their houses. Some had been fined hundreds of dollars. Others had been publicly shamed during HOA meetings. It became clear that this wasn't about maintaining aesthetics, it was about control. Every rule was a tool, every fine a weapon, and I was the next target. Late one night, I sat on the edge of my driveway, staring at the concrete that had become the center of this absurd war. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more extreme than the last. Could I fight back legally? Could I appeal to neighbors? Or was this battle destined to drag on endlessly, a slow erosion of my sanity and peace? Then came the turning point. I noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible arrogance in their communications, the smirk behind the formal language, the certainty that I would comply. They believed that compliance was inevitable, and in that moment, I realized that if I wanted to protect what was mine, I couldn't rely on reason, patience, or bureaucracy. I had to act in a way that would make them reconsider. The tension kept building with each letter, each inspection, each whispered rumor in the neighborhood. I felt trapped in my own home, every movement scrutinized, every decision second-guessed. Friends and family began expressing concern, but I couldn't share everything. I didn't want to seem paranoid, and besides, some of the neighbors were watching, taking notes, and reporting back to the board. The stakes became even higher when they threatened legal action. They hinted at liens, fines that could snowball into thousands, and a level of intimidation designed to force surrender. My mind raced with anxiety. This was no longer just about a driveway. It was about control, about pride, about whether I could stand firm in the face of an institution that thrived on fear. And then, as if orchestrated for maximum effect, the final warning came. An official notice, thicker than the others, stamped with urgency, demanding compliance within days, or else. The letter was cold, impersonal, but the message was clear. This was the last chance, the final line before the real escalation. I read it over and over, my stomach twisting. What would they do if I didn't comply? How far would they go to assert authority over a driveway that was undeniably mine? The absurdity of the situation was almost laughable, and yet the fear it instilled was very real. I realized that the next move could define everything. The peace of my home, the control of my life, and the precedent for anyone else in the neighborhood who might dare to resist. And that's when I made a decision. If they thought a letter, a fine, or bureaucratic intimidation would make me back down, they were about to learn that they had underestimated the lengths I would go to protect my property. What came next wasn't just about rules or bylaws. It was about sending a message they wouldn't forget. By the time the final notice arrived, I had reached a breaking point. Months of fines, inspections, whispered judgments, and petty rules had built an invisible cage around my life. Every morning I walked onto my driveway with a knot in my stomach, unsure if today would bring another letter, another subtle threat, or a new inspection meant to unsettle me. The HOA had made it clear they expected submission, and for the first time I realized that submission was a choice I would never make. The day of reckoning began quietly. I woke to the sound of distant engines and the soft hum of tires on pavement. I knew they were coming, though I didn't know who they would be. Board members, inspectors, a lawyer sent to enforce compliance. My mind raced through every scenario, calculating how each confrontation could escalate. And then, I stepped outside and saw at the driveway, my driveway, no longer just a strip of concrete, but the battlefield on which this war would be fought. I had spent the previous night planning. It wasn't about recklessness. It was about asserting what was mine in a way they couldn't ignore. The tractor sat at the edge of the yard, gleaming under the morning sun, a silent symbol of resolve. It was massive, commanding, and, more importantly, mine. Every bolt, every tire, every inch of steel represented weeks of work, planning, and, above all, determination not to be bullied. As I climbed onto the seat, heart pounding, the board members arrived. Their faces were a mix of disbelief and irritation, as if the audacity of a homeowner taking a stand was somehow offensive. Cameras clicked from neighbors who had gathered quietly along the street, drawn to the escalating tension like moths to a flame. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, the judgment, the curiosity, the thrill of witnessing a confrontation that had been simmering for months. The board's initial reaction was incredulous silence, followed by formal outrage. "You cannot do that! That vehicle is far too large. It violates." But I didn't wait to hear the rest. The tractor rolled forward slowly, deliberately, occupying the space they had claimed as theirs, the very edges of the driveway they insisted I didn't own. Every inch it covered sent a message: this is mine. I am not moving. They scrambled to find authority, letters, citations, bylaws, but the sight of the tractor, immovable and commanding, rendered their paperwork insignificant. The neighborhood held its breath. For weeks, I had been powerless on paper, bound by rules and intimidation. But here, on this driveway, I held the power, and they knew it. I could feel their frustration mounting, the thin veneer of control cracking with each second the tractor remained in place. Their attempts to reason, to demand compliance, to assert authority, all fell flat against the sheer audacity of one homeowner standing his ground. And in that moment, I realized something vital: the power they wielded over me existed only because I had allowed it. Remove fear, and authority crumbles. Hours passed. They threatened legal action, fines, even towing, but the message was clear. This wasn't about bending to rules. It was about reclaiming agency, defending a home, and exposing the absurdity of petty power when confronted with courage and resolve. Every neighbor watching learned the same lesson silently: bureaucracy is formidable only until someone refuses to bow to it. By the late afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the street, the board retreated, papers in hand, their composure shattered. They had faced the unexpected, the immovable, the homeowner unwilling to be cowed. And as the neighborhood exhaled collectively, I sat atop the tractor, a mix of triumph, exhaustion, and disbelief washing over me. The battle wasn't just over a driveway. It was a statement, a turning point, a moment of vindication that would be remembered long after letters and fines had faded into memory. Yet even in victory, a lingering question hung in the air. Would they try again? Would new rules, new letters, new inspections appear? Or had this moment, this audacious stand, changed the rules forever? One thing was certain: The driveway was mine, and I had proven that standing firm could topple even the most absurd authority. And as I finally descended from the tractor, letting it rest back where it belonged, I knew the story wasn't just about concrete and bylaws. It was about refusing to be silenced, about reclaiming control over your life, and about making sure that the people who think they hold power over you understand that power only exists if you allow it. After the tractor stood its ground, the tension in the neighborhood shifted in ways that were immediately noticeable. For weeks I had been living under the weight of scrutiny, under the gaze of a bureaucracy that thrived on petty power. But the audacity of one decisive action had rippled far beyond my driveway. Neighbors whispered not in fear of fines, but in quiet admiration. What had once been a community teetering on control and intimidation began to tilt toward something far more honest: awareness, accountability, and the recognition that rules, no matter how rigid, are meaningless when wielded without reason. The HOA didn't vanish overnight, nor did the petty rules magically disappear. They tried letters, they tried threats, and in muted attempts, they even sought legal advice. But the energy of resistance, the fact that one homeowner could, in full view of the neighborhood, refuse to bow, was transformative. Their authority, which had felt absolute, was now fragile, scrutinized, and, in some corners, openly mocked. People began to speak up at meetings. Subtle acts of rebellion cropped up: a flower bed planted without approval, a mailbox repainted in defiance, car parked slightly outside the permitted line. The community's once rigid obedience was loosening, and it all started with a driveway and a tractor. Personally, life returned to a calmer rhythm, but it wasn't the same as before. The stress of the months-long conflict left marks: sleepless nights, heightened vigilance, and a sharpened sense of boundaries. Every interaction with the board now carried the memory of tension, of letters that could feel like daggers, and of the surreal escalation from garden tools to heavy machinery. Yet, with those scars came confidence. I had learned that preparedness, courage, and a willingness to act decisively could change the dynamics of power. Standing up wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming autonomy, demonstrating that bureaucracy has limits when confronted with resolve. Neighbors who had once assumed neutrality began to interact differently. Some approached with apologies for past gossip, others with curiosity about what had been done. Conversations turned from whispers of fear to discussions about fairness, rules, and accountability. The HOA meetings, once predictable forums of intimidation, became less about asserting control and more about negotiation and dialogue. There was still bureaucracy, yes, but it now existed in a more balanced form, less oppressive, more visible, and held in check by the community itself. Financially, the situation resolved with a surprising twist. The fines had accumulated, but most were waived or invalidated once the absurdity of their enforcement became public. Legal threats dissolved under scrutiny, and even when small fees remained, they were trivial compared to the months of anxiety and confrontation. Insurance documents, property deeds, and photographs, all meticulously documented throughout the struggle, had provided an invisible shield, proving that preparation and persistence could counter even aggressive tactics. The HOA's attempt to leverage bureaucracy into absolute control had failed, demonstrating a critical truth: rules, no matter how formal, are only as powerful as the people who enforce them, and as compliant as those they target. Beyond the immediate resolution, there were broader consequences. The story spread quietly at first, then more openly, inspiring discussions across the community and in neighboring subdivisions. Conversations about HOA authority, property rights, and resident autonomy gained traction. People realized that standing up, even in small ways, could prevent the kind of unchecked power that leads to petty harassment. Some residents, emboldened by the example, began documenting communications and challenging overreach. The collective awareness that authority could be questioned, not recklessly but with preparation and courage, shifted the neighborhood culture. What had been a community living under subtle fear became a community learning to negotiate power dynamics thoughtfully, without surrendering personal rights. Reflecting on the emotional journey, I understood that the tractor wasn't just metal and hydraulics. It symbolized resolve, creativity, and the refusal to be intimidated by letters and regulations. The absurdity of the confrontation, the juxtaposition of serious bureaucracy and the sheer audacity of a homeowner asserting dominance with a piece of machinery, became a teaching moment. Fear thrives in silence and compliance. Courage thrives in visibility and decisive action. The lesson extended beyond property lines into life itself. Systems of control, no matter how structured, rely on consent. Withdraw that consent, act decisively, and the balance shifts. Even months later, the driveway remained unchanged. The concrete bore the tire marks of the tractor not just physically but metaphorically, a reminder of the confrontation and the victory over unreasonable authority. The neighborhood, though imperfect, had become more aware, more cautious in enforcement, and subtly more humane. Residents were more willing to question the rules, the board's motives, and the interpretations of bylaws that had previously seemed absolute. Conversations became collaborative rather than combative. Small victories, once overlooked, now carried weight because everyone had witnessed what assertive action could achieve. There were personal consequences, too. The months of stress left a lingering awareness of vulnerability. I knew that standing up required energy, planning, and resilience. But those lessons were invaluable. The conflict taught patience, strategic thinking, and the importance of documentation. More importantly, it reaffirmed self-worth and the right to defend personal property against petty tyranny. When bureaucracy overreaches, it is not invincible. Awareness, courage, and decisive action can restore balance even in seemingly powerless situations. As the dust settled, I also recognized a subtle but profound transformation within myself. Fear, once a constant companion, had been replaced by confidence. Anxiety about authority had given way to clarity about boundaries. And though the conflict had demanded far more energy and attention than I ever imagined, the triumph carried its own reward: the knowledge that standing firm, creatively, strategically, and decisively, can shift the narrative from victimhood to agency. The HOA learned its limits, neighbors learned theirs, and I learned mine. The driveway had returned to its rightful place, not just as a physical space, but as a symbol of resilience. Letters and fines became artifacts of a battle already won. Inspections and threats became reminders that power, when unchecked, can be challenged. Most importantly, the story offered a lesson to anyone living under the weight of petty authority: empowerment is possible, and sometimes the boldest act, though unconventional, is exactly what it takes to reclaim control. So as I look back at that driveway, at the tractor, and at the months of tension, the takeaway is clear: rules, letters, fines, and bureaucracy may attempt to dictate life, but they cannot define it. Authority thrives on compliance, intimidation, and fear, but when courage steps in, boundaries are redrawn and absurdity is met with audacity. The question remains: when faced with unjust control in your own life, will you comply? Or will you find your metaphorical tractor and take a stand?